The smell reached her before the light did. A woman stood in a shed in the middle of January. Burlap pulled open at her feet, and the air was sweet and wet and wrong, the smell of food turning back into earth. She was pulling beets out one at a time, pressing each one with her thumb, setting the firm ones to the right and the soft ones to the left. The soft pile was larger. Behind her, through the open door of the cabin, a small girl lay on a pallet near the stove, her breathing shallow and her eyes half closed. The woman did not look at the beets. She looked at the cabin door. Then she said, to no one who was there yet, "She has not eaten in 3 days." The shanty sat 2 miles east of the rail siding at Harlan Creek, Dakota Territory, and it was not finished. One wall had no chinking between the boards. The roof beam stopped 6 feet short of the back edge, covered with canvas that popped and sagged in the wind. A woman stood in front of it in October of 1885, 22 years old, holding a deed with her dead brother's name still on it, and a debt ledger that said she owed $31 to 3 different men in town. Peter Lunde had died 9 days earlier. A freight wagon axle snapped on a rutted crossing south of the creek, and the load shifted, and by the time 2 men pulled the sacks off him, the damage was done. He was 26. He left behind the claim, the shanty, 70 feet of split rail fencing, a plow that needed a new share, $6 in coin, and his sister Marit, who had come west from Minnesota in July to help him prove up the homestead, and now owned everything he owed. She stood in the yard and looked at what the debt had bought. The shanty was 12 by 14 feet, built of rough-sawn boards nailed to a post frame. 3 walls had chinking, a mixture of mud, grass, and straw packed into the gaps between boards. The 4th wall, facing northwest, had nothing. Wind came through the cracks in straight lines. At night, sitting by the stove, she could feel distinct jets of cold air on her neck and the backs of her hands, each one tracing the exact location of a gap in the wood. The shed was worse. It was 8 by 10 feet, built in a single afternoon from lumber scraps and freight crate sides, with a door that hung on leather hinges and a dirt floor that turned to mud when it rained. Inside, the entire harvest sat in conditions that would destroy it. The carrots, 83 of them, pulled from the ground a week before Peter died, sat in a heap on the dirt floor. They were already losing moisture. The ones at the bottom, pressed against the damp earth, had started to soften where the soil touched the skin. The beets filled 2 burlap sacks leaning against the wall. The burlap was damp. Inside, the beets pressed against each other with no air between them. Their skins were thin, and where one beet pushed against another, the surface was already darker than it should have been, not rotten yet, but heading somewhere. The potatoes, about 30, sat in a broken crate with no lid and a cracked side. 3 of them showed soft, dark spots where they had knocked against each other in transport or struck the crate wall. One had a split in the skin the length of a thumb, and the flesh underneath was wet and discolored. There was no root cellar. Peter had planned to dig one in September, after the harvest was in and before the ground froze. September came and went, and he was still hauling freight for cash to pay down what he owed on seed and lumber. Now it was October, and the man who was going to dig was under the ground instead of in it. Marit had never built anything larger than a shelf. She had never wintered alone. She had helped her mother pack jars and hang meat in Minnesota, but her mother had a stone-lined cellar, a husband, 3 sons, and 20 years of experience. Marit had a shed with a dirt floor, a shanty with one open wall, and a pile of root vegetables sitting in a weather that was turning against them by the day. The first frost came on the 11th of October. It was not deep, just enough to silver the grass at dawn and make the mud crack underfoot like thin pottery. But it was a message. The ground would freeze solid, the air would follow, and everything sitting unprotected in that shed would either shrivel from dryness, freeze from exposure, or rot from contact before the year turned. She counted the months, October to May, 7 months before anything green would push through the soil. One harvest between her and hunger. No cellar, no crew, no money, and no one coming. Elias Hovde arrived on the 14th. He came on horseback, which was how Elias did everything, mounted, unhurried, looking down from a height that made other people feel like they were being assessed. He was 58 years old, had been on his claim for 11 years, and operated what the settlement considered the finest root cellar on the northern plains. 8 feet deep, stone-lined walls, a timber door that sealed so tight a candle flame inside would not flicker. The temperature in that cellar did not move more than 4 degrees between November and March. Elias had built 3 cellars in his life, each one dug by crews of 4 men over 2 weeks in late summer, when the ground was soft and good timber was available, and the work could be done without racing the frost. He had come to see about the claim, he said. What he meant was he had come to see about the debt. Elias dismounted and walked the property without asking permission. He looked at the unchucked wall and pressed his thumb against the edge of one board. He walked the shed. He pushed the door open with one hand and stood in the frame, blocking the light with his shoulders, and stared at the heap of carrots, the damp sacks, the broken crate. Marit stood behind him. She did not speak first. She had learned in Minnesota that men like Elias delivered their judgment whether you asked for it or not, and interrupting only gave them something to push against. Elias said, "You have no cellar." She said, "No." He crouched and picked up a carrot from the bottom of the heap. He held it between his thumb and forefinger and squeezed. The skin gave slightly. He dropped it back and wiped his hand on his coat. He reached into the burlap sack and pulled out a beet. The surface was moist. He rubbed his thumb across the skin and looked at the dark smear it left. He stood and turned to face her. Elias said, "Your brother owed Amos Creel $14 for seed and nails. He owed the freight company $11 for the hauling. He owed me $6 for the plowshare I lent him in June. That is $31 of debt on a claim with no income and no finished shelter." He let that settle. Then he continued, "You have maybe 1.25 cords of firewood stacked against the south wall. You need 6 minimum to get through winter in a shanty with gaps in it. You have food for one person sitting in conditions that will ruin it inside of 8 weeks. Carrots on a dirt floor will go limp in 3. Beets and damp burlap will start turning in 4. Potatoes bruised like those will rot from the inside before Christmas." He paused. "And you have no one to dig, no money to hire, and the ground is already setting up hard enough that a spade bounces." He said it the way a man reads a weather almanac. Not cruel, not kind, just measured, each fact landing with the weight of its own certainty. Merritt said, "I know what I have." Elias looked at the shed one more time. He said, "A proper cellar takes 4 men, 2 weeks, and more lumber than you can buy at the prices Amos charges. Even if you started digging tomorrow morning, you would not finish before hard freeze. You would exhaust yourself, ruin your hands, and still have a hole in the ground with no walls and no roof." He put his hat back on. "Your brother was a good worker, but a poor planner. I'm sorry he's gone. But you should think hard about whether this claim is worth staying on when there is nothing here to keep you alive through March." He mounted his horse. He said, "I will take the $6 for the plowshare when you have it." Then he rode back toward town without waiting for her answer. Marit stood in the yard and watched him go until the horse was a dark shape against the gray grass. The wind picked at the canvas on the unfinished roof behind her. It made a sound like a hand-slapping cloth. Inside the shed, the carrots were already losing what they could not afford to lose, and the potatoes were pressing their bruises deeper into each other's skin. She went into the shed and crouched. She picked up the potato with the split skin. The flesh around the wound was wet and soft and had a smell, faint, sweet, wrong. She pressed her thumb into it and felt it give, like pressing into cold bread dough. She put it down and picked up a carrot from the bottom of the heap. The end that had rested on the damp dirt was limp. The root had started to go translucent where the moisture had broken down the tissue. She stood up and looked at the whole collection. 83 carrots, 40-some beets, 30 potatoes. Maybe enough food to last one person through winter if every piece survived intact. But every piece would not survive intact. Not like this. Not heaped and sacked and piled in a drafty shed with a dirt floor and no insulation and no temperature control and no separation between sound vegetables and damaged ones. 6 to 7 months of winter. One harvest, no cellar, no crew, no money, no way out. She stood there until the light changed and the cold deepened and the first star appeared through the gaps in the shed wall. The memory came 3 nights later. Marit sat near the stove in the shanty with the wind coming through the unchucked wall. She had a blanket over her shoulders and her boots still on. She was not thinking about storage. She was thinking about the firewood, whether the cord and a half stacked outside would last until she could find a way to cut or trade for more. The stove ate wood the way the wind ate heat, steadily, constantly, without mercy. But somewhere between the stove and sleep, her mind drifted back to Iowa, and the memory arrived whole, like a scene viewed through a window. She was 8 or 9 years old. She was in Decorah in the house of a woman named Ragna, a second cousin or a neighbor's aunt, some connection Marit had never clearly understood. Ragna was heavy and quiet, with hands that were always working, and she kept a storage room behind her house that was cool and dry and smelled like earth and clean wood. What Marit remembered most was the sand. Ragna had wooden boxes with planed sides, 6 of them, lined against the wall. She filled the bottom of each box with dry sand, pale, fine, clean, poured from a sack she kept in the corner. The sand went into the depth of a hand. Then Ragna laid carrots on the surface, one by one, spacing them so that no root touched another. She placed each one deliberately, turning it once, checking the skin with her thumb before setting it down. Then another layer of sand. Then more carrots. Then more sand. She did the same with beets. The potatoes went somewhere else entirely. Ragina kept them separate, on wooden slats in the darkest corner of the room, away from the root boxes. She went through every potato by hand, turning each one slowly, pressing the skin, checking for cuts and soft spots and bruises. Anything damaged went into a separate basket. Those would be eaten first. The rest, only the sound ones, only the unblemished, went onto the slats. Marit had watched this from the doorway and asked why she did it that way. Rana had not stopped working. She placed a beet into the sand, covered it, and said, "One bad root sweats against the next, and then you lose the lot." One sentence. The kind of thing a child hears and puts away in the same place as proverbs and weather rules and the names of plants that should not be touched. It did not mean anything urgent at the time. It was adult knowledge. It would make sense later. It made sense now. Marit pushed the blanket off and went to the shed in the dark with a lantern. She crouched over the carrots and pulled 2 from the bottom of the heap. They were damp where they had been touching. The skin on one had softened where it pressed against its neighbor. Not rotten, not yet, but the surface was starting to break down. Moisture was passing between them. She pulled out the potatoes and lined them up on the shed floor. She turned each one. 5 out of 30 had dark spots. 3 of those spots sat at exactly the points where the potatoes had rested against the crate wall or pressed into each other. The damage was not random. It was structural. It was happening at every contact point. She looked at the burlap sacks of beets. The sacks themselves were damp. The beets inside were warmer than the air, which meant they were generating heat, which meant something biological was happening inside those sacks that should not be happening. The logic built itself like a dry stone wall, one piece fitting against the next. Vegetables in contact shared moisture. Moisture softened skin. Soft skin opened the door to decay. Decay spread at every point of contact. One damaged root could take its neighbors with it. A sack of 50 beets pressing against each other was not 50 individual vegetables. It was one connected system where a single failure could propagate outward until nothing was left. The answer was not colder air, not a sealed room, not a deeper hole. The answer was separation. Every root apart from every other root. Sand between them to buffer moisture, to keep conditions steady, to hold each carrot and beet in its own individual space where it could neither give nor receive what it should not. And the potatoes, which bruised differently, rotted differently, needed different conditions, kept entirely separate, sorted by hand, inspected by touch, with every damaged one pulled the moment it showed. She did not need a cellar. She needed crates, clean, dry sand, and the patience to handle every root one at a time. The risk announced itself immediately. If she was wrong, if the sand trapped moisture instead of buffering it, if conditions inside the crates turned against the vegetables in ways she could not detect until it was too late, she would have buried her only food supply in boxes she could not easily see into. By the time she discovered the failure, the rot would be everywhere. She would have destroyed her harvest with her own method. She sat on the shed floor and ran the odds against each other. If she did nothing, the carrots would keep softening on the damp dirt. The beets would keep pressing together in damp burlap. The potatoes would keep bruising. She would lose a quarter of her supply by early December, a third by January, and half by February. By March, she would be at Amos Creel's counter buying flour on credit at whatever terms he dictated, and the debt would compound until it ate the claim. If she packed them in sand, separated, dry, inspected weekly, she might keep more. She might lose less. She might make it to spring with enough food to stay standing. It was not certainty. It was the best wager she had. And standing in a shed full of slowly dying vegetables with $31 of debt and an unchucked wall at her back, the best wager was the only one worth placing. Anna Bjornes came by 2 days later, which was how information traveled on the prairie, not by announcement but by proximity and curiosity. Anna lived a mile north. Her husband worked the railroad section crew 3 weeks out of 4, which meant Anna ran the household, the stock, and most of the claim work by herself for 21 days at a stretch. She was 30 years old, built for labor, and had the kind of practical intelligence that weighed every idea against the question of whether it would actually work when your hands were full and the weather was against you. She brought a jar of pickled cabbage. She set it on the shed floor and looked at the sand Marit had spread near the stove to dry. Anna said, "What is this?" Marit told her. She explained the separation. She explained the sand. She explained the potatoes kept apart, the damaged roots pulled, the layers packed so nothing touched. Anna listened without interrupting. Then she said, "So you're going to bury your food in sand and hope it lasts?" Marit said, "I am going to keep every root separate so one bad piece cannot ruin the rest. The sand holds them apart and keeps conditions steadier than air, and I will sort everything by hand first and throw out anything that is already damaged." Anna said, "And what about when the sand gets damp? You are in a shed with a dirt floor and gaps in the walls. How do you keep sand dry in a space that is not dry?" Marit said, "I dry the sand before I pack it. I keep the crates off the floor on boards. I seal what I can." Anna said, "And if something goes wrong in the middle of a crate, if a carrot starts to turn 3 layers down under 2 hands of sand, you will not see it. You will not smell it. You will reach in one day and pull out mush, and the layer below it will be worse. At least when beets sit in a sack, I can open the sack and look." That was the real problem, and Anna was right to name it. Visible storage was honest. Hidden storage was a gamble on conditions you could not see. Marit said, "I will check them. Every week. I will open each crate, run my hands through the sand, feel every root, and pull anything that has changed." Anna said, "Every week? You have a wall to chink, firewood to cut, water to haul, a stove to feed, and a debt to manage, and you are going to spend a day a week feeling through sand for soft spots?" Marit said, If the food holds, I have a winter. If the food fails, I have nothing. The time it costs to check is less than the time it costs to starve. Anna picked up her cabbage jar. She said, I hope you're right. There was no warmth in it. There was the careful neutrality of a woman who had seen too many good ideas die on the prairie to put her faith in any of them before the proof came in. After Anna left, Marit walked to the creek. The water still moved, but the banks had started to ice. The sand deposits along the near bank were exposed and reachable, but the ground around them was stiffening day by day. She picked up a fistful and squeezed it. Damp from the creek, but good grain, coarse enough to drain, fine enough to pack around a root without scratching the skin. She needed crates. She had one broken crate and no money for lumber. She needed sand. She had a creek that was freezing. She needed time. She had the sound of Elias Hovde's voice telling her the ground was already setting up and winter was not going to wait. The mockery started before she had solved the crate problem. Amos Creel heard about it from someone, probably one of the men who rode past the claim and saw Marit hauling canvas sacks up from the creek, and Amos heard everything first because the store was where everyone stopped, and Amos had the kind of ear that collected other people's failures the way a ledger collects debts. He stood on the porch of his store on a Tuesday morning, coat open, vest buttoned, and said loud enough for the three men sitting on the bench and the woman buying salt to hear, Pater's sister is burying her harvest in river sand. She's planting supper in December. One of the men laughed and said, maybe she expected turnips to sprout indoors. Amos said, she owes me $14 for seed and nails her brother bought and never paid for, and she's hauling sand like a child building a castle. I give it until January before she is standing at this counter asking for flour at credit she cannot repay. He said it with a smile. Amos always smiled when he talked about credit. Credit was his instrument. Every family that ran short in winter owed Amos Creel by spring, and the terms were always in his favor because the terms were always set when people were hungry, and Amos was the only man with flour. The talk spread from the store porch outward, through the settlement like smoke through a drafty room. By the end of the week, half of Harlan Creek had heard some version. A young woman alone on a dead man's claim was hauling sand from the creek and burying edible food in wooden boxes, as though hiding it from the season. Children repeated the phrase, planning supper in December, as a joke. Men shook their heads, passing her property on the road. One woman at the store said it was a shame about Peter, but a bigger shame that his sister was going to waste the harvest he had worked for. The laughter did not break Marit the way she thought it would. What hurt was the silence from the people she thought might understand. Anna did not return after their conversation in the shed. Elias sent no word. The Peterson family and the Leon household passed her on the road and nodded but did not stop. She was alone with the idea, and the only commentary she heard came from people who had already decided she was wrong. She kept working. She could not afford for the laughter to be right. She could not afford to stop and confirm what they believed. And underneath the mockery, underneath the doubt, underneath Elias measuring her failure in firewood cords, and Anna weighing her hope against prairie experience, underneath all of it, there was the image of Ragna's hands placing carrots in sand one at a time. Patient, methodical, certain. One bad root sweats against the next, and then you lose the lot. If that was true, the laughter did not matter. If it was not true, the laughter was the smallest thing she would lose. The crate problem resolved itself through scarcity, which was how most things on the prairie got solved, not through planning, but through whatever turned up and could be used. Merritt walked to the rail siding on a Thursday and found what she hoped for. Stacked behind the freight office, splintered and half crushed, were the remains of shipping crates that had carried hardware, seed, and dry goods into Harlan Creek over the summer and fall. The freight agent, Tollef Grindheim, was a quiet man with a bad knee who had known Pater and felt the particular guilt of a man who had watched someone work himself toward a debt he could never outrun. Tolliff told Marit she could take whatever she could carry. He did not charge her. He also did not help her carry it. She hauled 7 crates in 3 trips, balancing them on her shoulders and across her forearms, walking the 2 miles from the siding to the claim, in boots that were starting to split along the sole. The crates were rough, nails bent at angles, boards cracked, one missing a side panel entirely, but the wood was sound underneath the damage. She could repair them with Pater's hammer, his dull-bladed saw, and a coffee can of salvaged nails. The sand came harder. She hauled it in a canvas sack from the creek bank, filling the sack only a quarter full because a full load was too heavy to lift and walk with on the uphill path she had worn through the dead grass. Each trip from creek to shed took 40 minutes. She needed the sand bone dry, so she spread each load on a flat board near the stove inside the shanty, waited overnight, and turned it by hand in the morning, running her fingers through the grains, breaking apart damp clumps, picking out stones and roots, and anything that was not clean, dry sand. The first 2 days of hauling gave her enough dry sand for 1 crate. She needed enough for at least 5. Her hands blistered on the second day. The canvas sack rubbed her right shoulder raw through her coat, and by the 3rd morning the skin there was broken and weeping. Her lower back had settled into a grinding ache that did not ease when she sat down or lay flat. It just changed shape, moving from sharp to dull, and back again with every position. On the 4th day of hauling, the temperature dropped 8 degrees overnight. She stood at the creek in the early morning and watched the ice thickening along the banks. The sand deposits were still exposed where the current ran fast, but the ground around them was hardening into a surface her boot heel bounced off. If she waited another week, the banks would freeze solid, the sand would be locked under ice, and whatever she had not hauled would stay where it was until April. She made 6 trips that day. By the last one, she was dragging the sack on the frozen ground, pulling it with a rope looped under her arms, her legs shaking from exhaustion, leaving a track through the frost like a sled trail without runners. Her fingers were cracked and bleeding at the knuckles. She could not fully close her right hand. But the sand was in the shed, enough for 5 crates, maybe 6 if she kept the layers thin. That night she sat on the shed floor with the lantern and sorted the carrots by hand. Everyone. She picked up each root, turned it once, twice, ran her thumb along the length of the skin, pressed gently at the tip and the shoulder, and set it in one of 2 piles. Sound on the left, damaged on the right. She lost 9 carrots to the reject pile. 9 out of 83. Some were nicked. Some had soft spots at the shoulder where they had pressed against the ground. One was cracked lengthwise and had already begun to weep. She carried the rejects to the compost heap behind the shanty and buried them where they could not touch anything she needed to keep. Then she started on the beets. Sorting the beets took longer. Their skin was thinner, and the signs of damage were subtler. A slight give under the thumb, a discoloration that might be soil or might be the beginning of something worse. She rejected 6. She set the rest aside in rows on a clean board. Then the potatoes. She turned each one under the lantern, checking every surface. The 3 with visible dark spots went immediately. 2 more had skin that felt slightly wrong under her fingertip, a softness that might mean nothing or might mean everything in a week. She hesitated. She put them in the reject pile. She could not afford to gamble on, maybe. The sorting took 3.5 hours. Her back felt like someone had driven a nail between her shoulder blades. Her hands were stained purple-red from beet juice, gritty with sand, cracked at every knuckle. But when she finished, she had 3 separate groups of sound vegetables and a reject pile that would have been invisible buried inside sacks and heaps, silently spreading damage for weeks. She did not pack a single crate that night. She was too tired to trust her hands with the work that mattered most. She went into the shanty, lay down on the floor beside the stove in her coat and boots, and slept with sand in her hair and beet stains on her palms while the wind came through the unchucked wall and the temperature outside dropped another 3 degrees. If you have ever had people mock your work before they understood what you were building, tell us about it in the comments because Marit Lunde was not finished yet, and neither were the people who doubted her. Tomorrow she would start packing the crates, layer by layer, root by root, sand between everything. She would build the thing that Elias Hofde said she could not build, in the space that Almas Creel was betting would fail, with the method that Anna Bjornes hoped would work but could not trust. And somewhere in the settlement, in the sheds and dugouts and root bins where families had stored their own harvests the way they always had, heaped, sacked, piled, touching, the vegetables sat in the dark, pressed against each other, sharing moisture neither owner could see. What none of them knew yet was that the danger was not the cold that was coming. The danger was what would happen when the cold stopped. The next morning she started packing. She took the best crate, a hardware shipping box from a St. Paul supplier, oak sides, nails still tight, and set it on 2 flat boards she had laid across the shed floor to keep the wood off the damp earth. She poured dry sand into the bottom to the depth of 4 fingers. Then she knelt beside the pile of sound carrots and began laying them in, one at a time, each carrot placed on the sand with a finger's width of space between it and the next. She turned each root once, set it down, and covered it with sand before placing the one beside it. When the first layer was full, 11 carrots side by side but not touching, each one cradled in its own depression in the sand, she poured another layer of sand over the top, smoothing it with her palm, pressing gently to fill the gaps without crushing the vegetables beneath. Second layer. 11 more. Sand between them and sand above them. It was slow. It was maddening. It was the kind of work that made her want to grab a handful and shove them in because the cold was deepening and the daylight was shortening, and every hour spent on one crate was an hour not spent chinking the wall or cutting firewood or doing any of the other 30 things that stood between her and survival. But she did not rush. She placed each root the way Ragna had placed them, deliberately, one at a time, with the patience of someone who understood that speed now meant loss later. The first crate took her most of the morning. 44 carrots packed in 4 layers with sand between everyone. When she finished, the crate was heavy, 60 pounds, maybe more, and the carrots were invisible beneath the sand. She could not see them. She could not check them without unpacking. She had to trust that what she had done was right. She started the second crate after a meal of cold beet greens and a piece of bread she had been rationing since the week Peter died. The man who would change everything arrived on the 3rd day of packing, and he did not arrive to help. Soren Kavame was 64 years old, a widower and a carpenter by trade and temperament. He had built houses, barns, freight sheds, coffins, church pews, and one schoolhouse in the 22 years he had lived on the plains. He walked with a stiffness in his left hip that made his gait uneven, and he carried a canvas tool roll everywhere he went, the way other men carried a rifle or a Bible. He had known Peter slightly, had sold him the plowshare that was now part of Marit's debt to Elias, and had heard about the sand from the same gossip current that carried everything in Harlan Creek. He came to see the crates, not because he believed in the method, because he was a carpenter, and when someone told him a woman was packing food into freight crates held together with bent nails and split boards, the part of his mind that understood joinery could not leave it alone. He stood in the doorway of the shed and watched Marit smooth sand over a layer of beets in the 3rd crate. He did not speak. She did not notice him for several minutes because she was focused on the spacing and the lantern was behind her and the shed was dim. When she looked up, he was leaning against the door frame with his arms crossed and his tool roll hanging from one hand. He said, "That crate will not hold." Marit said, "It has held for 2 days." Soren said, It has held 2 days sitting still on flat boards in weather above freezing. When the temperature drops, the wood will contract. Those nails are bent, which means they have lost their grip once already. The left side panel is cracked along the grain. When the sand settles and the weight shifts, that crack will open and you will lose the bottom third of whatever you packed in there. He said it without condescension. He said it the way a man who has watched wood fail for 40 years states what he knows will happen next. Marit looked at the crate. She looked at the crack he was pointing at. It was thin, a line she had noticed and dismissed because the board still felt solid when she pushed on it. She said, "I do not have better crates." Soren set down his tool roll. He said, "You have crates that can be made better." He crouched beside the third crate, slowly, his hip protesting, and ran his fingers along the cracked panel. He pressed at 3 points. Then he looked up at her and said, "Do you have a saw?" She brought him Peter's saw. He examined the blade, ran his thumb across the teeth, and said, "This has not been sharpened since your brother bought it." He pulled a small flat file from his tool roll and began working the teeth one at a time, his hands steady and automatic. While he sharpened, he talked, not about sand or storage, about wood. He said, "A freight crate is built to survive one journey. The nails are driven fast, the joints are loose, and the wood is whatever was cheapest. If you want it to hold weight through a winter, weight that settles, weight that shifts when temperature changes the wood, you need to do 3 things." He held up one finger. Reinforce the corner joints. A nail in soft grain pulls out. A nail through a corner brace into hard grain holds. Second finger. Replace cracked panels before they fail. A crack along the grain will open. It is not a question of weather. It is a question of when the weight and the cold conspire. Third finger. Raise the bottom off whatever it sits on. Wood on damp ground wicks moisture. Moisture rots the bottom boards first, and by the time you notice, the contents have been sitting in damp for weeks. He finished sharpening the saw and handed it back. Then he pulled 2 short pieces of oak from his tool roll, offcuts, scrap, the kind of thing a carpenter keeps without thinking about it, and showed her how to cut a corner brace and nail it through both panels at the joint. It took 20 minutes. When they were done, the cracked panel was stabilized, the corner was solid, and the crate felt different in her hands when she lifted the edge, tighter, more certain, the kind of structure that resists rather than gives. Soren stood. He said, "Fix the other crates the same way. Brace every corner, replace anything cracked, and get them off the ground." He picked up his tool roll. He started to leave. Then he stopped in the doorway and looked back at the rows of beets disappearing under the sand. He said, "The packing is good, the spacing is right, but the crates are what hold the packing, and if the crates fail, it does not matter how careful you were with the sand." Then he left. Marit stood in the shed and looked at the corner brace. It was simple. It was obvious. The way everything a skilled person does looks obvious after you watch them do it. But she would not have known to do it, and the crack in that panel would have opened in January, and the sand would have spilled and the beets would have tumbled against each other in the dark, and by the time she checked, the damage would have been spreading for weeks. She started bracing the other crates that afternoon. Soren came back 3 days later. He did not announce himself. He walked into the shed and looked at the corner braces she had cut and nailed. He tested 2 of them with his hand. One he nodded at. The other he pulled out, recut at a different angle, and re-nailed without saying a word until it was done. Then he said, "You learn fast, but you're cutting the braces too thin, a 1/4 inch thicker, and they take the stress without splitting." This became the pattern. Soren appeared every 2 or 3 days, always unannounced, always with his tool roll, always finding something that needed correction or improvement. He did not explain himself. He did not declare he was helping her. He simply arrived, identified a structural problem, fixed it or showed her how to fix it, and left. On his third visit, he brought slats, thin strips of pine, hand-planed, smooth, and showed her how to build a raised platform inside the shed so the crates sat on wood above the dirt floor instead of on boards sitting in the damp. The platform took an afternoon to build. When they were done, the crates were 3 inches off the ground and the air could move beneath them. On his fourth visit, he brought a hand plane and showed her how to smooth the inside surfaces of the potato boxes so there were no rough splinters or edges that could nick the skin of a potato and start the kind of wound that turned into rot. Each visit taught her something specific. Each lesson came through the hands, not through lecture. He showed, she watched, he corrected, she repeated. The relationship built itself out of wood shavings and quiet competence, and it was not charity. He never once treated it as charity. He treated it as the natural response of a man who understood materials, seeing someone work with materials who needed to understand them better. On the 5th visit, they disagreed. Marit wanted to seal the shed walls completely, chink every gap, block every draft, to keep the cold stable inside. Soren shook his head. He said, "If you seal it, you trap whatever moisture is already inside. The potatoes breathe. The sand holds moisture from the roots. If that moisture has no way out, it sits in the air and settles back onto everything. You need the shed to breathe, but slowly. Controlled." Marit said, "If I leave gaps, the temperature swings with the weather. Cold, warm, cold again. Every swing stresses the vegetables." Soren said, "And if you seal it, the damp destroys what the temperature would only stress. Pick your problem. I would take the swings." They argued about it for 10 minutes. Marit was not used to arguing with a man more than twice her age, who had built more structures than she had years alive. But she made her case, and Soren listened, and in the end, they compromised. They chinked most of the gaps, but left 2 small openings near the roofline, one at each end of the shed, covered with burlap so that air could move through slowly without letting wind pour in. It was the first time they had built something together rather than Soren correcting what she had done alone. It felt different. It felt like the beginning of something that had no name yet, but was real. 3 weeks after Peter's death, Elias Hofde returned. He rode up to the claim at midday and sat on his horse and looked at the shed. The door was open. Inside, 5 crates sat on the raised platform, packed with sand and root vegetables, tight and orderly. A 6th crate was being packed. Marit was kneeling beside it, pressing sand around a layer of carrots. Elias dismounted. He walked to the shed and looked inside. He looked at the crates. He looked at the platform. He looked at the corner braces. He said, "Who built the platform?" Marit said, "Soren Kvamme showed me how. I built it." Elias said, "Soren is a good carpenter." He paused. "But a good platform does not make this a cellar." He crouched and looked at one of the packed crates. He could not see the vegetables, only sand. He pushed his finger into the surface. It went in half an inch before hitting the first carrot. He said, "You cannot see what is happening inside these." Marit said, "I check them weekly. I unpack the top layer, feel through the sand, pull anything soft." Elias stood. He said, "1 good week means nothing. 2 good weeks means little. The test is not October. The test is January, when the air dries out and the wood contracts and the temperature has been swinging for months, and every root in every shed in this settlement is under pressure." He looked at her. "I hope this works, but hope is not insulation, and sand is not stone walls and 8 feet of earth." He did not say she was wrong. He said she had not yet been proven right, and he was correct. October success was cheap. The real examination was still 2 months away. He rode off without mentioning the debt. By the 1st of November, the system was complete. 6 crates of carrots and beets packed in dry sand, layered and separated, sitting on the raised platform 3 inches above the shed floor. 2 slatted boxes of potatoes, sorted, inspected, unblemished, in the darkest corner, covered with burlap to block light. The shed walls chinked except for the 2 ventilation gaps near the roofline, a piece of salvaged canvas over the door to reduce drafts. The floor swept clean. Marit did her first full inspection on November 3rd. She unpacked the top layer of each crate, ran her hands through the sand, felt every root she could reach. The carrots were firm. The beets were firm. The sand was dry. No smell. No softness. No moisture where there should not be moisture. She repacked layer by layer and felt something she did not trust: relief. November passed. December came. The temperature dropped steadily, 10 degrees one week, 15 the next, then a sharp plunge in mid-December that brought the air down to 18 below zero for 3 days. The shanty shook. The stove consumed firewood faster than Marit could cut it. She ate carefully, 1 meal a day from the packed roots, supplemented with the last of the bread and the pickled cabbage Anna had brought weeks ago. Every Monday she inspected. Every Monday the roots held. The sand stayed dry. The crates held their shape. The corner braces tight. The platforms solid. The wood contracting in the cold, but not cracking because Soren had shown her where to brace and how to read the grain. She lost 2 carrots in the second week of December, soft at the tip, the first sign of surrender to conditions. She pulled them immediately. She lost 1 beet in the 3rd week. She pulled it. The potatoes in their separate boxes remained firm. The settlement settled into winter the way the prairie always did, hunkered, quiet, enduring. Smoke rose from every chimney. The road between claims hardened into a frozen track. Amos Creel's store stayed warm and well-stocked and waited for the customers that January always brought. The thaw came in the 2nd week of January. It began on a Tuesday night. The temperature, which had been sitting at 12 below zero for 6 days, climbed suddenly. By Wednesday morning, it was 28 degrees above zero, a swing of 40 degrees in less than 18 hours. The air changed. The brutal, dry, sterile cold that had been pressing down on the settlement for weeks was replaced by something different, something damp, something wrong. The clouds came in low and gray. The wind shifted south. The snow on the rooftops began to melt. Water dripped from every eave, ran down every wall, pooled on every floor that was not sealed tight. The frozen ground softened at the surface, just the top inch, just enough to turn the roads to slush and the yards to mud. But it was not the ground that mattered. It was the sheds. Every storage shed in Harlan Creek had been sealed against the cold. Walls chinked, doors battened, cracks stuffed with rags and straw. The cold had been the enemy, and they had fought it the way the prairie had taught them, by sealing everything tight and keeping the weather out. But what they had sealed in was the moisture. Moisture from the vegetables themselves, breathing in the dark. Moisture from the dirt floors, frozen solid for weeks, now softening just enough to sweat. Moisture from the thaw air, damp and warm and heavy, pressing through every gap the cold had not found. In the sealed sheds, the temperature swung, the humidity climbed, and the vegetables, which had been holding in the cold, surviving it, enduring it, were suddenly sitting in conditions that were worse than freezing. They were sitting in warm damp. The first ruined stores were found on Thursday morning. A man named Knut Peterson opened his storage bin, a wooden chest his wife had packed with potatoes and turnips in October, and pulled out a fistful of collapse. The potatoes had sweated. The skins were wet. 3 of them had gone soft in the center, and the flesh was brown and sour-smelling where they had pressed against each other. The The turnips were worse. The ones at the bottom of the bin, where moisture had pooled, were covered in a slick film that came off on his fingers. He pulled out more. Half the bin was compromised. The vegetables that were still firm were damp on every surface that had touched another vegetable. He went to the lean household and found the same thing. Their beet sacks had gone damp inside. The burlap was wet. The beets were dark at every contact point, and 3 had split open where the expanding moisture had cracked the skin. By Thursday afternoon, 4 families had opened their stores and found loss. By Friday, 6. The word spread faster than the damage. People running between claims in the mud, asking, checking, hoping their shed was different. It was not different. The heaped, sacked, piled vegetables that had survived the cold had not survived the damp. The bruises that nobody had sorted out in October were rotting now. The contact points were failing. One bad root was sweating against the next, and the lot was going. Elias Hofde opened his root cellar, his 8-foot, stone-lined, timber-doored masterwork, and found that even his beets had suffered. The cellar temperature had stayed stable, but the beets he had stored in bulk, touching, unsorted, had transmitted moisture between them during the thaw. His potatoes were better, his cellar was deep enough to buffer the swing, but his carrots, piled in baskets without separation, had gone limp at the bottom where the weight pressed them together. He stood in his cellar with a lantern and held a beet that dissolved between his fingers. Elias Hofde, who had built 3 cellars in his life and had told Marit Lunde she needed 8 feet of earth and stone walls, was losing food to the same enemy that was taking everything else: contact, moisture, and the failure to separate what should never have been touching. Anna Bjornes sent her oldest boy to Marit's claim on Friday morning. The boy was 12 and out of breath and said his mother needed help. Their stores were failing. Half the potatoes were soft. The beet sack had gone sour, and Anna's youngest, a girl of 3, named Christy, had a fever. She had been eating poorly for days because the good food was running out, and what remained tasted wrong, and now she was hot and weak, and Anna was frightened. Marit went. She walked the mile to Anna's claim in the mud and the gray, damp air, and found Anna in the shed with the beet sack open at her feet. The smell hit Marit in the doorway, wet, sweet, organic, the smell of food turning back into earth. Anna was pulling beets out one at a time and sorting them by touch, firm on the right, soft on the left. The soft pile was larger. Anna looked up. She did not say anything about the sand or the crates or the conversation they had had in October. She said, "Christy has not eaten a full meal in 3 days. What she ate yesterday made her sick." Marit looked at the beets. She looked at the potatoes in the corner, piled in a sack, dark-spotted and damp. She said, "Stop feeding her anything from those piles, anything soft, anything that smells, anything that has touched something soft, throw it out." Anna said, "If I throw out everything that has touched something soft, I throw out most of what I have." That was the math. That was the math for every family in Harlan Creek. The rot was not isolated. It was systemic. It had spread through every contact point in every heap and sack and bin. And separating the good from the bad now was like trying to separate water from wet cloth. Marit said, "I will bring you food." She walked back to her claim. She went into the shed. She opened the first crate of carrots. She pushed her hand down through the sand, past the first layer, past the second, down to the 3rd row of roots buried 2 months ago in October. The carrots were firm. Not just firm. They were crisp. The sand around them was dry. There was no smell, no moisture, no softness at the contact points because there were no contact points. Every carrot sat in its own pocket of sand, separated from every other carrot by a barrier that had absorbed the moisture the root shed and held the conditions steady while the air outside swung 40 degrees in a night. She opened the second crate. Beets. Same result. Firm, dry, sound. The sand had done what the burlap in the baskets and the bulk bins had not done. It had kept each root alone. She checked the potato boxes. She ran her hands over every surface. 3 potatoes had softened slightly, the ones nearest the door, where the thaw air had reached them first. She pulled those 3 and set them aside. The rest were holding. They were not perfect. They were not laboratory specimens. But they were sound, and they were edible, and they were the difference between eating and not eating for the next 60 days. She packed a sack with 18 carrots and 10 beets from the opened crates, repacked the layers carefully, and carried the sack through the mud to Anna's claim. If you are holding your breath right now, hit subscribe, because what happens next in Harlan Creek changes everything, and you do not want to miss it. Anna took the sack. She looked inside. She picked up a carrot and turned it in her hands. It was firm and clean and smelled like earth and sand and nothing else. She pressed her thumb against the skin, and it did not give. Anna looked at Marit. She said, "How?" Marit said, "They never touched each other." By Saturday, 3 more families had opened their stores and found ruin. The thaw continued, warm, gray, damp, relentless. Roof water dripped day and night. The mud deepened. The air inside the sheds stayed humid and wrong. Amos Creel opened his store early that week. He had flour. He had salt. He had dried beans. He had the prices of a man who understood that scarcity was profit, and he adjusted them upward without announcement. Flour that had been $2 a sack in November was now $3. Beans were up by 1/3. He did not explain. He did not need to. Hungry people did not negotiate. But not everyone came to Amos. The word about Marit's crates moved through the settlement the way the word about her failure was supposed to have moved. Only the content was different. The Peterson family came first. Knut, who had pulled collapsing potatoes from his bin on Thursday, walked to Marit's claim on Sunday and asked if she had food to share and what she would want for it. Marit did not sell. She gave him 12 carrots and 6 beets and told him to eat the ones with any softness first and save the firmest for last. Knut said, "What did you do?" Marit said, "I kept them apart." The lean household came on Monday. Then a woman from the far side of the settlement whose name Marit had never learned, walking 3 miles in the mud with an empty sack and 2 children at her side. Each time Marit opened a crate, each time the vegetables inside were sound. Each time the person who watched her brush sand off a firm carrot while their own stores liquefied in their sheds stood quiet for a long moment before speaking. But the food was finite. 83 carrots at packing, 40-some beets, 30 potatoes minus the cold ones. Enough for one person for 7 months, maybe, if nothing spoiled and she ate carefully. Not enough for one person and the families who were coming to her with empty sacks and hungry children. She did the math again, standing in the shed with the crates open and the sand cooling her hands. If she gave freely, she would run out before March. If she rationed to her own household only, she would survive, but the people she refused would go to Amos Creel, and the debt would eat them the way it had almost eaten her. She did not have enough food to save the settlement. She had enough to prove that the method worked. And the method, the separation, the sand, the sorting, the inspection, was something she could give away without running out. She started with Anna. Anna's daughter Christy had stopped eating by Sunday. The fever had deepened. She lay on a pallet near the stove with her eyes half closed and her breathing shallow, and Anna sat beside her and watched and could not do anything because the food that remained in the house was compromised, and the store was a 3-mile walk through mud at prices she could not afford. Marit brought her carrots and clean beets and boiled a broth from the beets that evening while Anna held the child. Christy took 4 sips of the broth and kept it down. She took 4 more an hour later. By Monday morning, her temperature had eased, and she had eaten a piece of boiled carrot mashed soft with the back of a spoon. She was not dying. She had been close to the edge of something, malnutrition deepening into something worse, fever feeding on a body that had no fuel to fight it, and the clean food pulled her back. Anna sat on the floor of her shanty with the empty broth bowl in her hands and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Show me the crates." Marit brought her to the shed the next day. She opened each crate. She pulled carrots and beets from the sand and showed how they looked after 2.5 months of storage. She showed the potato boxes. She showed the one she had culled, the 2 carrots, 1 beet, 3 potatoes, and explained that pulling them early had kept the damage from spreading. Anna touched the sand. She rubbed it between her fingers. She said, "This is what I told you would not work." Marit said, "Yes." Anna said, "How do I do it? I have lost half my stores. What is left? Can it be saved?" Marit said, "Sort everything first. Pull every root that has any softness, any smell, any discoloration at a contact point. What is left, pack in sand in whatever boxes you have. Keep each one separate. Keep the potatoes apart from everything else. And check every week." Anna said, "I do not have enough sand." Marit said, "The creek bank is thawed enough to dig." Anna looked at her. She said, "You were right. I should have said so before now." Marit said, "You were right too. I could not see inside the crates. I had to trust the method and check every week. That was a risk. It just happened to be the right one." The thaw lasted 9 days. When the cold returned, hard, dry, brutal, dropping the temperature back to 10 below in a single night, the damage was done. Across the settlement, families had lost 1/4 to half of their stored vegetables. Some lost more. The Petersons had almost nothing left. 2 families on the far claims had already gone to Amos Creel and signed credit slips they would be paying off through summer. In Marit's shed, the crates sat on their platform in the cold and held what they held. She had given away enough food to thin her reserves by 1/5. She would be hungry before spring. She might be very hungry by April. But she would not starve, and the food that remained was sound, and the method that had preserved it was now something she could teach to anyone who would listen. The winter was not over. There were 2 months of cold left, and another thaw was possible, and the firewood was running low, and the debt had not gone away. Elias still had his $6 to collect. Amos still held the $14 note for Pater's seed and nails. But something had shifted. The settlement had watched Marit open a crate in January and pull out firm vegetables while their own stores collapsed. And that image, sand brushed off a sound carrot while thaw water dripped from the roof, was not something that could be unseen. The question was no longer whether the method worked. The question was, what happened next? Elias Hofte came to the shed on a Wednesday, 8 days after the thaw broke. He did not come on horseback. He walked. Marit saw him coming across the frozen track from 1/4 mile away, his tall shape unmistakable even at a distance, his gait slower than she remembered, as if the cold or the walk or something heavier than either was pressing down on him. He stopped at the shed door. The door was open. Inside, the crates sat on the platform in the cold light, packed and orderly, sand smooth on the surfaces. Elias said, "I would like to see them." Marit stepped aside. He walked in and crouched beside the first crate, slowly, his knees stiff. He pushed his hand into the sand the way he had in October, but this time he went deeper. He felt through the first layer of carrots. He pulled one out and held it in front of his face and turned it. He pressed his thumb against the skin. It did not give. He smelled it. Earth and sand and nothing else. He put it back and felt through the second layer. He pulled a beet from the third crate and did the same thing. Firm, dry, Sound. He stood and looked at the potato boxes. He picked up 3 potatoes, one at a time, and examined each surface. He set them back. He stood in the center of the shed with his hands at his sides and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "I told you that you needed 8 feet of earth and stone-lined walls. I told you that sand was not a cellar." He paused. "I was not wrong about what a cellar does. I was wrong about what else could do it." Marit said, "Your cellar kept the temperature steady. That matters. My crates did something different. They kept each root separate so the damage could not spread." Elias said, "My beets touched each other. Everyone. I stored them in bulk the way I have stored them for 11 years, and when the thaw came, the ones with bruises I never checked for took the ones beside them." He looked at the sand. "I lost a third of my beets and a quarter of my carrots. My potatoes held because the cellar temperature stayed low enough, but the roots that touched, those I lost." He said it without anger. He said it like a man reading a lesson he had paid for with food he could not replace. Marit said, "The separation is what matters. The sand is just the tool. If you had sorted your beets and stored them apart, even in the cellar, you would have kept more." Elias looked at her. He said, "I know that now." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small cloth bag. He set it on the edge of the crate. $6, the plowshare debt. Consider it paid." Marit opened the bag. $6 silver. She said, "You do not owe me anything for the food I did not give you." Elias said, "I owe you for the lesson I should have learned before I lost a third of my stores." He put his hat on. "If you will have visitors next autumn, I would like to see how you pack the layers. I have built cellars my whole life. I have never thought about what happens inside them between the vegetables." He walked back the way he had come. Marit stood in the shed with $6 in her hand and the knowledge that the man who had measured her failure in October had just measured his own. The visitors came steadily through the rest of January and into February. They came singly and in pairs, walking or riding through the cold, stamping mud and ice from their boots at the shed door. Each one wanted to see the crates. Each one wanted to touch the sand. Each one wanted to understand how vegetables packed in October were still firm in January when their own stores were failing or already gone. Marit showed them the same way each time. She opened a crate. She pulled a root. She showed the spacing. She showed the sand between the layers. She showed the potato boxes with their separation and their dark corner and their burlap cover. She showed the reject pile, the handful of roots she had culled over the winter, caught early, pulled before they could damage their neighbors. She explained the logic in plain language standing in the shed with her hands in the sand. Roots that touch share moisture. Moisture softens the skin. Soft skin lets decay in. Decay spreads at every contact point. One bad root takes the ones beside it. A heap is not a collection of individuals. It is a chain, and one weak link ruins the rest. Sand keeps them apart. Sand buffers the moisture. Sand holds each root in its own space where it can neither give nor take what it should not. And the sorting at the beginning, the culling of every bruised and nicked and damaged root before packing, that is what keeps the chain from having weak links in the first place. She said it differently each time, adjusting to the person in front of her, but the core was always the same. Separate, sort, inspect. Do not let laziness at the beginning become loss at the end. Some of the visitors were skeptical even after seeing the proof. A man named Burnt from the far claims said sand was heavy and hauling was labor, and he did not have the time or the crates. Marit said he had less time to replace food he lost in February. Burnt left unconvinced. He came back in March after losing his last sack of turnips and asked her to show him again. Others adopted the method immediately. The Lien household, a family of 5 with 2 young children, came on a Saturday and spent 3 hours in the shed. The wife, a woman named Gertrude, was the kind of person who needed to understand a thing completely before she would trust it. She did not just look at the crates. She crouched beside them and pushed her hands into the sand and felt the layers the way Marit did during her weekly inspections. Gertrude said, "How deep are the sand layers between each row?" Marit said, 3 to 4 fingers, enough that no root can settle through and touch the one below. Gertrude said, "And beets versus carrots? The same depth?" Marit said, "The same. Beets are rounder, so they sit differently in the sand. I press a slight hollow for each one so it does not roll." Gertrude said, "Can you use the same sand the following year? Or does it hold too much moisture from the previous season?" Marit paused. She had not considered that. She said, "I do not know yet. This is the first winter. I would dry it thoroughly and sift it before reusing, but I cannot tell you whether it holds something invisible from one season to the next." Gertrude nodded. She said, "I will try it with fresh sand the first year. We can test the old sand the second." That was the moment Marit realized she was not the only person thinking about this method. Gertrude was already planning improvements, already imagining the next iteration, already building on a foundation that Marit had laid out of desperation. The method was not going to stay in one shed on one claim. It was going to change shape as other hands took hold of it. The visitors kept coming through the rest of February. Marit did not know all the answers to every question. She said so openly, every time. She said, "I did this once. I did it because I had no other choice and a memory of a woman who knew what she was doing. What I can tell you is what worked. What I cannot tell you yet is everything about why." That honesty did more for her standing than any claim of expertise would have. The people who came to her shed were not looking for a professor. They were looking for someone who had solved a problem they were drowning in and who would admit what she did not know while sharing what she did. Amos Creel did not come to the shed. He did not need to see the crates to understand what they meant. He understood it the way a man who sells umbrellas understands a clear sky, not as a fact about the weather, but as a threat to his income. Amos had built his winter business on scarcity. Families who ran short of food in January bought flour and beans and salt at whatever price he set, and they signed credit slips that carried interest. And by spring, they owed him enough that the summer's labor went partly to paying Amos before it went to improving the claim. It was not illegal. It was not even unusual. Every frontier storekeeper operated on the same principle. Winter made people desperate, and desperate people accepted terms they would refuse in July. Marit's crates threatened that structure. Not because she was feeding the whole settlement, she did not have enough, but because she was teaching people how to feed themselves. If families packed their own stores next autumn using her method, they would need less from Amos in January. And if they needed less, Amos's leverage evaporated. He responded the way a man of commerce responds to a competitor he cannot outwork. He talked. He stood behind his counter and told customers that the girl was lucky, that one warm winter did not prove a method, that sand storage was folk nonsense that would fail the first real cold year. He told people that proper storage was a proper cellar, that anyone who trusted freight crates over stone walls was gambling their family's survival on a child's idea. When Gertrude Lean came into the store for salt in early April, Amos said, "I hear you were out at the Lund claim looking at sand in boxes." Gertrude said, "I was." Amos said, "You know your grandfather kept a cellar in Norway that lasted 40 years. Stone walls, timber roof, 8 feet deep. That is storage. What that girl does with river sand and salvaged freight crates, that is a trick that worked once in a mild winter." Gertrude said, "My grandfather lost a third of his stores most years to the same contact rot that took half this settlement's food last month." Amos did not have an answer for that. He measured out the salt and charged her the full price and said nothing else. But when she left, he told the next customer, loud enough for the two men on the porch to hear, that people were being taken in by a girl who had gotten lucky and was now acting as if she had invented something that any farm wife with a sack of sand could have done. He did not say it to Marit's face. He said it to the people who had just been to her shed in the moment they walked into his store, when his voice carried the authority of a man standing behind goods they needed and credit they depended on. Some listened, some did not. But the talk continued, and it planted a seed of doubt that would germinate if the next winter went differently. February brought the deepest cold of the year, and it brought Soren back to the shed. He had been absent for 3 weeks. His hip had worsened in January, and the walk to Marit's claim was difficult in the ice and mud. But he came on a Tuesday in February with his tool roll and a piece of oak board under his arm and said he wanted to build something. He wanted to build a better crate. Not the salvaged freight boxes Marit had patched and braced. A purpose-built storage crate with proper joints, proper dimensions, proper ventilation. A crate designed for the specific task of holding root vegetables in sand through a Dakota winter. They built it together over 4 days. Soren taught her how to measure and cut tongue and groove joints that locked without nails. He showed her how to select boards by reading the grain. Tight grain for the sides where strength mattered. Wider grain for the bottom where slight flex would absorb the settling weight of sand. He taught her how to drill ventilation holes in the bottom boards, small enough that sand would not sift through, but large enough that air could move beneath the contents. They argued about the dimensions. Marit wanted the crate large, big enough to hold 50 carrots in 5 layers. Soren wanted it smaller. He said, "A crate with 50 carrots weighs 80 pounds when the sand is in. If you need to move it, you cannot. If a bottom board fails, you lose 50 carrots instead of 25. Smaller crates mean smaller losses." Marit said, "Smaller crates mean more crates, more wood, more joints, more labor." Soren said, "More crates mean more control. You inspect one at a time. You move one at a time. You lose one, you still have the others. Build it too big and you're putting all your winter in one box." She thought about it. He was right. She had been thinking about efficiency, how to pack the most food in the fewest containers. Soren was thinking about failure, how to contain the damage when something went wrong. They built the crate to hold 25 roots in 3 layers. It was tight, square, well-jointed, and it sat on its own slatted base that lifted the contents 2 inches off whatever surface it rested on. When Soren ran his hand along the finished side, the wood was smooth and the joints were invisible. He sat on the shed floor with his back against the wall and his bad hip stretched out and said, "My wife kept a kitchen garden in the early years. Peas, beans, squash, a few roots. She packed her beets in straw and lost half of them every winter. I built her better shelves, better bins, a better root room, but I never thought about what was happening between the vegetables. I was solving the wrong problem." Marit said, "You were solving the problem you could see." Soren said, "That is what carpenters do. We see the structure. We miss what is inside it." He was quiet for a while. The stove in the shanty was audible through the wall, a low tick of burning wood. Outside, the wind pushed against the shed and found the 2 burlap-covered ventilation gaps and moved through them slowly, the way Soren had said it should. He said, "Her name was Dagny. She died in the spring of 79. Fever. I built her coffin, and I have built things every day since because the day I stop building is the day I sit down and do not get up." Marit did not reply. There was nothing to say to that. She sat across from him in the dim shed with the crates between them and the sound of the wind and the stove, and the silence held the weight of what he had told her without needing anything added. Soren died on the 9th of March. He had been at the shed 2 days before, checking the ventilation gaps, adjusting a slat that had warped in the cold. His hip was worse. He moved slowly, and twice he stopped and braced himself against the crate platform with both hands and waited for something in his body to ease. Marit had offered him coffee. He had accepted. They had sat in the shanty and talked about the coming spring and what she would plant and how many crates she would need for next autumn's harvest. He left at midday. He said he would come back on Thursday to help her plan the dimensions for a set of smaller potato boxes. On Thursday morning, Tollef Greinheim rode out from the siding and told Marit that Soren had been found in his cabin on Wednesday evening. He had died sitting in his chair with his tool roll on the table beside him, and the oak offcuts for the potato boxes stacked at his feet. The stove had gone cold. A cup of coffee sat half-finished on the table, which meant it had happened quickly between one sip and the next, between one thought and the silence that followed it. The doctor said it was his heart. Marit went to the cabin. She stood in the door and looked at the chair and the table and the tool roll and the wood and the cold stove and the half cup of coffee. The cabin was small and clean and held the smell of wood shavings and linseed oil that she had come to associate with every place Soren occupied. His coat hung on a peg. His boots stood beside the door. The bed was made. She did not cry. She stood there until the light through the window changed angle and fell across the tool roll and lit up the brass fittings on the canvas. Then she picked up the tool roll and the oak pieces and walked back to her claim. The walk took 40 minutes. She did not stop. She built the potato boxes that weekend. She measured and cut and joined the pieces the way Soren had shown her, tongue-and-groove joints, grain red for strength and flex, ventilation holes drilled in the base. Her first cuts were too shallow, and she had to recut 2 boards. Her joints were not as tight as his. She could see the hairline gaps where his would have been seamless. But the boxes held. When she set the first finished box on the shed platform and ran her hand along the side, the wood was smooth, and the joints were firm, and the shape was right. She set the second box beside it and stepped back and looked at them. They were not as beautiful as what Soren would have made. They were solid. They would hold potatoes through a winter. They were built with the knowledge his hands had passed to hers, and that knowledge would not die because the hands that gave it were gone. There is a kind of knowledge that lives in the hands before it lives in the mind. It comes through repetition, through correction, through the feel of a blade meeting grain at the right angle and the sound of a joint closing tight. Soren had given her that, not through lectures, not through theory, through the quiet, specific, patient act of showing her where to cut and how to feel what the wood was telling her. Every joint she cut for the rest of her life would carry the memory of his corrections, the angle adjusted, the pressure changed, the nod that meant right. She hung the tool roll on a nail inside the shed, where she could reach it without looking. The secondary crisis came in late March, when winter should have been loosening its grip, but was not. A family named Espeland, a man, his wife, and 3 children, had arrived at their claim in September from Wisconsin and had done everything wrong. They had stored their harvest in a single dugout pit covered with straw and boards. The pit had flooded during the January thaw, and they had lost most of their vegetables. They had gone to Amos Creel for flour and beans on credit, and the credit had run out because Amos had set a limit based on what he thought the family could repay from summer labor, and Amos's calculations did not include generosity. The Espeland children were hungry. The youngest was 4 years old. The wife, a woman named Marte, had walked to 3 neighboring claims asking for food, and had received a few potatoes here, a jar of pickled, something there, but the neighbors were thin themselves after the thaw losses, and what they could spare was not enough. Marte came to Marit's shed on a Tuesday afternoon. She stood in the door with her coat buttoned wrong, and her hands red from the cold, and asked if there was anything left. Marit had food, not much. She had given away a fifth of her stores in January and had been eating carefully since. She had perhaps 6 weeks of food remaining for herself, enough to reach spring if the spring came on time, and if she supplemented with whatever she could forage or trade. She could not feed 5 more people for 6 weeks. The math was brutal. But she could feed them for a few days, and she could do something else, something Soren would have done, something that addressed the structure of the problem, and not just the immediate weight of it. She gave Marte a sack of carrots and beets. Then she said, "Bring your husband tomorrow. Bring whatever crates or boxes you have. Bring whatever food you have left, even if it looks bad. And bring sand if you can haul it." Marte said, "Sand?" Marit said, "I will show you what to do." The next day, the Espeland family arrived at Marit's claim with 2 broken crates, a burlap sack of half-soft potatoes, and a bucket of damp sand the husband had chipped from the creek bank. Marit spent the entire day teaching them. She started with the sort. She emptied their burlap sack onto the shed floor and lined the potatoes up, and she showed Marte how to check each one. She put a potato in Marte's hand and said, "Press here, at the base. Feel that give? That softness means this one is already failing. It goes in the eat now pile. It does not go in storage. It goes in the pot tonight before it can take anything else with it." Marte pressed another potato. She said, "This one feels the same." Marit said, "Then it goes in the same pile. Be ruthless with the sort. Anything you are unsure about, eat it now. Only the ones you are certain are sound go into storage. Certainty is the price of the method." They sorted 18 potatoes. 11 went into the eat now pile. 7 were firm enough to store. Then she showed the husband, Tam, a man named Halvor, broad-shouldered, quiet, who had built rail fences in Wisconsin and knew wood but had never thought about storage as a problem that carpentry could solve, how to brace the crate corners. She handed him Pater's hammer and the coffee can of salvaged nails and showed him the angle Soren had taught her. He drove the first brace with 2 strokes. The second took 3 because the wood split and he had to start again. She showed the oldest child, a boy of 10 named Embret, how to sift sand. She poured the damp bucket of creek sand onto a board and said, "Feel through it. Pull out the stones, break the clumps, spread it thin so it dries. The sand has to be dry before it touches the food, or you are packing moisture in with the roots and doing the opposite of what you want." The boy worked at it seriously, his small fingers sifting through the grit, pulling out pebbles and root fragments and setting them aside in a pile that grew through the afternoon. She did not have enough sand or enough crates to pack their remaining vegetables properly, but she showed them the principle: separation, dryness, inspection, and she explained where to find sand at the creek, how to dry it near a stove, and how deep the layers should be for different roots. Halvor said, at the end of the day, "Why are you doing this?" Marit said, "Because someone showed me, and if they had not, I would be standing where you are standing." If this story reminds you that the knowledge we share is worth more than the knowledge we keep, pass it along to someone who needs to hear it. She thought of Soren. She thought of Ragna. She thought of the chain of hands that had passed this knowledge to her, not through books, not through schools, but through the specific physical act of one person showing another where to put their fingers and what to feel for. The Espeland family left with enough food for a week and enough knowledge to save what they had left. It was not enough. It was something. Amos Creel watched the traffic to Merritt's claim from his store porch and said nothing for 2 weeks. Then, in early April, when the snow was finally retreating and the first hints of thaw for good were in the air, he made his move. He began telling customers that the sand method was common sense, that anyone who had ever stored root vegetables knew you should keep them separate, that the girl had not invented anything, that she was taking credit for old knowledge, and the settlement was foolish to treat her like a prophet. It It was a clever attack because it contained a kernel of truth. Marit had not invented separation. Ragna had not invented it. The principle was old. What Marit had done was apply it systematically, under pressure, without a cellar, using materials she could get for free, and prove it worked when everything else failed. But Amos was right that the underlying idea was not new, and saying so made the people who had come to Marit's shed feel slightly foolish for not having known it already. The talk worked on some. Bernd, who had come back in March after losing his turnips, stopped mentioning Marit's name when he described the method to others. He said he had heard about it without saying where. Two families who had visited the shed began referring to the approach as the sand way, without attaching her name to it. Marit heard about this from Anna, who heard about it at the store. Marit said, "I do not care whose name is on it. I care that people do it." Anna said, "You should care. If Amos takes the credit, he takes the authority. And if he takes the authority, he decides who gets help next winter and who does not." That was the danger Marit had not seen. The method was not just knowledge, it was power. Whoever controlled the knowledge controlled winter, and if Amos could reframe the method as common sense that he had always endorsed, he could position himself as the settlement's authority on storage. The man who stocked the supplies and knew the techniques, and Marit would return to being the girl on the dead man's claim. She did not know how to fight that. She knew how to pack sand and sort roots and read the grain in a board. She did not know how to fight a man who sold flour and managed reputation for a living, but winter was ending. Spring was coming. And between now and next October, she had time to build more crates, teach more families, and make the method so widely known and so clearly attached to her shed that Amos could not separate it from the person who had proven it worked. The first green shoots appeared in the second week of April. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes. The creek ran open and fast, carrying the winter's ice toward the river. Marit stood in the shed with Soren's tool roll hanging on the nail, and the 6 crates on the platform, and the potato boxes in the dark corner, and she planned next autumn. More crates, smaller crates, the way Soren had said. More sand. A bigger shed, maybe, if she could find the lumber. And a system not just for her own harvest, but for anyone who wanted to learn. She had survived winter. She had fed herself and helped feed others. She had lost a mentor and gained something she could not yet name, but could feel in the calluses on her hands, and the steadiness in her voice when she told Marte Espeland where to press her thumb. The hostile skeptic was still talking. The debt was not fully paid. The claim was still rough and half-finished and held together with salvaged nails and canvas and stubbornness. But the food had held. And the knowledge was spreading. And somewhere in the settlement, in sheds and dugouts and root rooms where families had always piled their harvest and hoped for the best, people were beginning to think about sand. The second autumn came, and Marit was ready for it. She had spent the summer working. She'd chinked the northwest wall, properly this time, with a mixture of mud, lime, and horsehair that Elias Hovde had shown her in June, standing beside her and demonstrating the technique the way Soren would have, through action and correction, not through lecture. She had cut firewood until she had 5 cords stacked against the south side of the shanty and another cord split and drying under canvas. She had planted a larger garden, carrots, beets, potatoes, turnips, and a row of cabbages, and the harvest had come in strong in September, nearly double what Pater had managed the year before. She had built 12 new crates over the summer, smaller crates, the way Soren had argued for. Each one held 20 to 25 roots in 3 layers, tongue and groove joints, corner braces, slatted bottoms with ventilation holes. She had cut every joint with Soren's tools from the canvas roll that still hung on the nail in the shed, and each crate was better than the last, because her hands were learning what his hands had known, the angle of the cut, the pressure of the plane, the sound a joint makes when it closes right. The shed was different too. She had extended it by 4 feet on the north side, using lumber she had traded for with labor, 2 days of hauling water for the Lane household in exchange for boards from a dismantled freight platform at the siding. The extension gave her room for 16 crates on the raised platform, with the potato boxes in the back corner and a workspace near the door where she could sort and pack without hunching over the crates. On the 1st of October, 1886, she began packing. She was not alone. Anna Bjornes came that morning, not to watch, to work. She brought her own crates, 4 of them, built over the summer by her husband during his weeks home from the section crew, following the dimensions Marit had given her in the spring. Anna carried 2 sacks of beets and a basket of carrots, and she set them on the shed floor and said, "Show me again from the beginning." Marit showed her. They knelt together on the shed floor and sorted, 2 women turning roots in their hands, pressing thumbs against skin, separating the sound from the damaged with a deliberateness that would have looked strange to anyone who had never watched a winter's food collapse in their hands. Anna's sort was slower because she was still learning the feel, the difference between firmness that would hold through February and firmness that was already beginning to give way beneath a surface that looked fine. Marit corrected her twice. The first time, Anna had set a beat in the sound pile that had a faint give at the shoulder. Marit picked it up, pressed it, and said, "Feel here. That softness. Last year a beat like this would have been fine in October and failing by December. It goes in the eat now pile." Anna said, "It feels almost sound." Marit said, "Almost is how the trouble starts. One root you are not sure about sits in the sand next to one you are certain about, and by January, the certain one is uncertain too." Anna moved the beet. She did not argue again. They packed the first crate together, Anna laying the roots while Marit poured the sand and checked the spacing between each one. By the second crate, Anna was packing alone, and Marit was standing at the side, watching, correcting only when a carrot was placed too close to the crate wall where the wood could transmit cold directly to the skin. Gertrude Lean came that afternoon with her oldest daughter, a girl of 12 who had steady hands and a serious face, and who sat on the shed floor sifting sand through her fingers the way Embret Espeland had sifted it the year before. Gertrude brought her own sand, hauled from the creek in August, and dried through September under canvas behind their cabin. She packed her crates with the precision of someone who had been thinking about this method for 6 months and had already decided where she would improve on what Marit had done. She used slightly deeper sand layers than Marit, 4 fingers instead of 3. She packed smaller roots in the center of each layer and larger ones near the edges, where the crate walls provided additional support. She kept a tally on a piece of folded paper tucked into her apron pocket. How many roots per layer? How many layers per crate? The date of packing? The condition of the sand? Marit looked at the tally and said, "I should have been doing that from the beginning." Gertrude said, "You had other things to think about last year. You were trying not to die. This year we write it down." Over the next 10 days, the shed saw more traffic than it had in the entire previous year. The Leon family, the Petersons, who had lost nearly everything in the first winter and were determined not to repeat it. The Espeland family, Halvor, Marte, and Embret, who arrived with 6 crates. Halvor had built himself over the summer using the bracing technique Marit had shown him in March. 2 families from the far claims who had heard about the method secondhand and rode 3 hours to see it for themselves. Each family brought their harvest. Each family sorted under Marit's eye. Each family packed under her correction. And each family left with crates that were tight, braced, filled with dry sand and separated roots, ready for whatever winter sent. By the end of the first week of October, 7 households had packed their stores using the sand method. Not all of them packed perfectly. The woman from the far claims had put 2 potatoes with soft spots into a crate because she could not stand to waste them, and Marit had made her pull them out and said, "You are not wasting food by rejecting those. You are wasting food by putting them in. But the method was spreading. It was spreading the way knowledge moves on the frontier, not through printed instructions or official channels, but through hands showing hands, through women kneeling on shed floors together, through the specific physical act of one person putting a root in another person's palm and saying, "Press here, feel that, this one stays, this one goes." Amos Creel adjusted his strategy in October. He stopped calling the method foolish. He could not call it foolish when 7 families were using it, and the woman who had proved it was teaching openly, and the first winter's results had been witnessed by everyone. Instead, he called it his own. He stood behind his counter and told customers that separation storage was something any experienced storekeeper knew about. He said he had been recommending careful handling for years. He said the girl had simply applied what was common knowledge among people who dealt in goods for a living, and the settlement was giving her credit for what any tradesman could have told them. He went further. He began selling sand. He had his hired man haul 3 wagon loads of creek sand to the store in mid-October, piled it behind the building, and posted a sign. Storage sand, 50 cents a sack. It was the same sand that was free at the creek bank a mile south. He was selling the convenience of not hauling it yourself, and he was selling something less visible, the association between his store and the method. Some people bought it. The Petersons, who were behind on their claim work after a difficult summer, paid Amos's price rather than make the trips to the creek that Merritt had made the year before with bleeding hands and a canvas sack dragged through the frost. Anna heard about the sand sales and walked to Merritt's claim and told her. Merritt said, "He is selling free sand." Anna said, "He is not selling sand. He is selling the idea that the method belongs to him. If people buy the sand from Amos, they associate the method with his store. If they associate it with his store, they come to Amos next year for advice, for supplies, for credit. He is not selling a sack of grit. He is selling authority." Merritt looked at the shed, the 12 crates on the platform, Soren's tool roll on the nail, the workspace where she had taught Anna and Gertrude and the Espelans and 7 other families. She said, "Then I need to keep teaching, more people, before he turns my work into his business." Anna said, "You cannot outspend him. You cannot outshout him, but you can do what he cannot do." Merritt said, "What?" Anna said, "Be the person who actually knows what she is doing. Anyone can sell sand, only you can show people what to do with it." The second winter tested the method at scale, and the test was harder than the first. The cold came earlier, a killing frost on September 28th, 3 weeks before some families had finished packing. One family on the far claims had not packed at all. They had planned to sort in the first week of October, and the frost caught them with their harvest still in baskets. The temperature dropped faster and deeper than the previous year. By mid-December, the air sat at 22 below for 4 straight days, and the wind came from the northwest without stopping, driving through every gap and seam in every structure in the settlement. The sheds creaked. The wood contracted. Nails popped in the night with sounds like small pistol cracks. In 2 households, crate corners split where the braces had been cut too thin or nailed into soft grain, exactly the failure Soren had predicted in his early visits to Merritt's shed, when he had run his fingers along cracked panels and said the wood would contract and the nails would lose their grip. But the packed crates held, not perfectly, not without loss. Gertrude lost 4 beets in the second week of January, a layer where the sand had been packed slightly damp, where the moisture had done exactly what Merritt had warned it would do if the drying was not thorough. Gertrude found them during her Monday inspection, soft, discolored, the skin giving under her thumb in the way that meant too late. She pulled them, repacked the layer with fresh sand from a reserve she had kept dry inside her cabin, and the loss stopped at 4. The previous year, a damp layer in a bulk heap would have taken 40. Anna lost 2 carrots and 1 potato. The Peterson family, who had packed late and sorted with less rigor than Marit wanted, lost a dozen across their 6 crates, but 12 out of 200 was a number a family could absorb without going hungry. The Espeland family lost nothing. Embret, who had become the strictest sorter in the settlement, had rejected 11 roots at packing time that his father thought were sound. Every one of those rejections proved correct when the discarded roots were checked a month later and found soft. No thaw came that January. The cold held. But the cold itself was a test because it stressed the wood and contracted the sand and pushed every vegetable to the edge of what it could endure. And the crates that had been built with care survived, and the crates that had been built with shortcuts did not. By February, Gertrude had numbers. She had tracked losses across 9 households that used the method and compared them to 2 households on the far claims that had not. Sand-separated storage with proper sorting, losses of roughly 1 root in 20. Higher for families who had packed with damp sand or sorted carelessly. Lower for the Espelands who had been ruthless. Traditional bulk storage, losses of roughly 1 in 4, concentrated at contact points and in the bottom layers where moisture had pooled. The difference was 5-fold. Gertrude wrote the numbers in her ledger and showed them to Marit, and Marit held the ledger and looked at the figures for a long time. The numbers were the method's proof in a form that could not be argued with, dismissed, or claimed by a man who had never packed a crate. They were recorded, dated, and signed by the woman who had collected them. Amos Creel's defeat arrived not in a single scene, but in a slow erosion that he could see and could not stop. The families who had packed with sand did not come to his store for flour in January. They did not sign credit slips. They did not stand at his counter with empty hands and accept whatever terms he offered. They ate from their crates firm carrots, sound beets, potatoes that had held through 22 below, and they did not need Amos Creel to survive. His flour sales dropped by 1/3 that winter. His credit ledger, which was usually thick with new signatures by February, stayed thin. The families who did visit came for salt and coffee and lamp oil, goods he sold at narrow margins, and they paid in coin, not in the interest-bearing credit that had been the foundation of his winter income for 15 years. He said nothing for 3 weeks. He rearranged his shelves. He adjusted his flour price downward for the first time in January in his career. He watched the road and counted the visits to Marit's shed, and each one represented a customer he would not see that winter. Then, in early February, a man from a far claim walked in and asked Amos for advice on sand storage for next year. The man had not been to Marit's shed. He had heard about the method third hand and assumed the storekeeper would know the details. Amos stood behind his counter. He could have claimed it. The words were ready. He had been rehearsing them since October, how he would explain the method as though it were standard trade knowledge, how he would sell the sand and the advice together, how he would become the settlement's authority on the technique the way he was already its authority on supply. But he thought about what would happen when the man followed instructions from someone who had never packed a crate, never sorted a root by touch, never knelt on a cold floor in October with sand under his nails. He thought about what would happen when the crates failed and the word came back to the store. Amos said, "Go talk to the Lund woman. She will show you how it is done." It cost him. His jaw tightened. He turned to the shelves and moved cans without purpose. But he said it. And the man left, and Amos stood alone in his store and understood that the economy he had built on winter hunger had changed in a way he could not change back. He did not apologize. He never acknowledged what he had done. He simply stopped opposing her, the way a river stops pushing against a stone it cannot move. He continued selling sand. Commerce was commerce, but he stopped pretending the knowledge was his. It was not a conversion. It was a surrender dressed in silence. And for Amos Creel, silence was the closest he would ever come to respect. The partnership began in the spring of 1887, and it started with a crate. A man arrived at the rail siding in April with a wagon, a set of farrier's tools, and a summer contract to shoe horses across the settlement and the surrounding claims. His name was Niels Stensland. He was 31, built like someone who had leaned over a forge since he was old enough to hold tongs, and he spoke with the flat vowels of a man who had grown up in Wisconsin with Norwegian at home and English in the road. Toluf Grindheim mentioned Marit the way Toluf mentioned things, offhand, as if the information were falling out of his coat pocket. He said there was a woman on a claim east of town who understood wood and joinery better than most men in the territory, and if Niels needed a box built for his tools, she was the one to ask. Niels rode out the following week. He found Marit in the shed packing dry sand into a reserve crate for autumn use, her hands gritty and her hair tied back with a leather strip. He said, "Toluf says you build crates." Marit said, "I build storage crates for root vegetables. If you need a tool chest, you need a different carpenter." Niels said, "I need a box that keeps iron tools dry through a Dakota winter. What keeps roots dry should keep iron dry. The problem is the same, moisture in a sealed space." That was a sensible observation, and Marit recognized it as the thinking of someone who understood materials, not just his own material, but the principle beneath it. They spent an hour discussing dimensions, ventilation, and the behavior of condensation inside a closed container during temperature swings. Niels knew iron. Marit knew wood and enclosed conditions. The conversation wove between their two kinds of knowledge, and each exchange built something neither of them had before they started talking. He came back the following week for the finished box. He ran his hand along the joints. He opened and closed the lid. He turned the box over and examined the ventilation holes in the base. He said, "This is good work." Marit said, "The joints are not as tight as the man who taught me would have made them." Niels said, "They are tighter than anything I could make myself, and the design, the raised base, the angled lid, the way the air moves through without the moisture following, that is not just carpentry. That is someone thinking about what happens after the box is closed." He began coming to the claim after that. He split firewood in exchange for smaller boxes for his forge supplies. He helped extend the shed roof in exchange for a horseshoe storage rack. Each exchange was practical. Each one took hours of side-by-side work, and in those hours they talked the way people talk when their hands are busy, openly, without agenda, about the things that mattered and the things that had brought them to the prairie. Niels told her about Wisconsin, the forge where he had apprenticed at 16, the master smith who had taught him that the difference between a good horseshoe and a bad one was not the iron, but the attention. The master had made him shoe the same horse 3 times in one day, until the fit was right, and Niels had been angry, and the master had said, "The horse does not care about your pride. The horse cares about its foot." Marit told him about Peter, about the wagon accident, about standing in the yard with the deed and the debt, and the shed full of vegetables that were already starting to fail. She told him about Soren, the tool roll, the corner braces, the argument about ventilation, the morning she had walked to the cabin and found him gone. She did not tell it as a tragedy. She told it as the sequence of events that had taught her hands what they knew. One afternoon in late June, they were rebuilding the shed door together, Niels holding the frame while Marit planed the edge to fit. And Niels said, "You talk about Soren's hands the way I talk about my master's, as if the knowledge lives in the hands themselves, and the person is just the one carrying them." Marit said, "That is exactly what it is. When I cut a joint now, I can feel his correction in the angle. When I sort a root, I can feel Ragnar's fingers in Dekra. The knowledge does not belong to me. It passes through me." Niels was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is how iron is too. Every smith learns from the smith before. The technique is older than any of us. We just carry it for a while. She looked at him. He was holding the door frame with both hands, his weight braced, his forearms steady, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man who has just discovered that the person beside him speaks a language he thought only he knew. By midsummer, the exchanges had become the excuse, not the reason. Niels came because the work was there and the person doing it was someone he wanted to be near. Marit watched for the shape of his horse on the track because it meant the afternoon would hold the particular steadiness that came from building something alongside someone who understood what building required. They married in September of 1887 in the yard between the shanty and the shed, with Anna beside Marit and Tollef beside Niels and Elias Hovde watching from horseback at the back, because Elias had never dismounted for a social occasion and saw no reason to start. Gertrude brought a ledger as a gift, leather cover, ruled pages. She said, "For the tallies, you will need a larger one than mine." The years compress the way years do when the work is steady and the purpose does not change. Niels built a forge on the claim in the spring of 1888. The sound of his hammer became the settlement's timekeeper, regular, audible, dependable. Marit expanded the shed into a proper storage barn that autumn, timber-framed and raised-floored, with ventilation designed from 3 years of Gertrude's data and her own experience. The barn took 6 weeks to build. Niels helped with the heavy framing. Elias Hovde, who had spent his life building cellars and was now interested in what happened above ground, contributed labor for 2 days and asked questions the entire time. Marit answered each one and noticed that Elias was taking notes on a folded piece of paper, the way Gertrude did, writing down dimensions and angles and the logic behind each ventilation gap. By the autumn of 1889, Marit was packing crates for 6 families besides her own, and 4 more were packing independently using the method and Gertrude's documented improvements. The third winter confirmed what the second had suggested. Losses across the sand-packing households dropped again, not dramatically, because the method had already captured the largest gains, but steadily, as families learned to sort more strictly and pack with drier sand and inspect on the schedule Marit had established. Gertrude tracked everything. She identified patterns that Marit had not seen. Beets packed after the first frost lasted longer than beets packed before it, which Marit believed was because the cold tightened the skin before storage. Potatoes in the darkest corner of a ventilated barn held better than potatoes near any wall with light exposure. Sand that had been used one season and thoroughly redried could be reused, but only if sifted and checked for organic matter that might hold moisture. The method evolved. It was no longer Marit's method alone. It was becoming the settlement's practice, refined by many hands, tracked by Gertrude's careful numbers, improved each year by people who brought their own observations and questions. But everyone knew where it had started. Everyone remembered the woman who had hauled sand from a freezing creek with bleeding hands and packed freight crates while the settlement laughed. Children learned first and learned best. Marit found that young hands sorted more honestly than adult ones. Children had not yet learned to make excuses for a route that felt almost right, but was not quite. She taught Embret Espelon to train younger children, and by 13 he could sort faster than most adults and pack with a precision that matched her own. Watching him teach a group of 8-year-olds how to feel for softness in a potato, his voice patient, his corrections gentle, his hands steady, Marit saw the chain extending one more link. Marit and Niels had a daughter in 1890. They named her Ragna. When the child was old enough to sit upright, Marit set her on the barn floor beside a crate and let her push small fingers into the sand and feel the smooth, cool surface of a carrot buried beneath. Ragna laughed and pulled her hand out covered in grit, and Marit brushed it clean, and the chain extended again. Niels once asked why she kept Soren's old tool roll on the nail in the barn when she had newer tools that fit her hands better. Marit said, because the hands that used those tools taught mine what they know. I keep them there so I remember the chain. Ragna in Decora. Soren at the shed door. Every person who showed another person what to do with their hands. It did not start with me. Niels said, "That is a lot of weight for a canvas roll." Marit said, "It is exactly the right weight." By the mid-1890s, the sand separation method was standard practice in Harlan Creek and had spread to 3 neighboring settlements through families who had moved or married outward. No one called it by a single name. They called it the sand way, or packing in, or sometimes among the older families who remembered the first winter and the thaw in the crates that held when nothing else did, the Lunde method. 14 families had adopted it fully by the 3rd year. By the 5th year, the count passed 22, and Gertrude's records, continued year after year in the leather ledger, and 2 more volumes besides, showed that winter food losses across the settlement had dropped from the old average of roughly 1 root in 3 to fewer than 1 in 10 for families who sorted with discipline and packed with dry sand. One detail from Gertrude's tallies outlasted all the others. In the households that followed the method strictly, sorting every root by hand, packing in dry sand, inspecting weekly, pulling the damaged without hesitation, not a single family went to Amos Creel's counter for emergency flour in January or February from 1887 onward. Marit lived out her years on the claim east of the rail siding at Harlan Creek. The shanty pater had started, and she had finished, became the heart of a larger house that Niels built around it, framing the new rooms so that the original 12 by 14 walls remained at the center, the way a tree grows rings around its core. The shed that had held 6 desperate crates in October of 1885 became a storage barn that served a dozen families and stood for 30 years. She taught until teaching was no longer necessary, until the knowledge had passed through enough hands that it carried itself forward without her presence, the way a fire keeps burning after the one who lit it walks away. She died in the winter of 1912 at 49, with Niels beside her and Ragna grown and married and living on a claim of her own where she packed her own crates every autumn with sand from the same creek. Soren's tool roll still hung on the nail in the barn. The first crate Marit had packed, repaired twice, its joints retightened, its wood darkened with 27 years of use, sat on the platform where it had always been. In January of 1886, when the thaw came and the sheds went sour, and the stored food of Harlan Creek collapsed under the weight of moisture and contact, and the quiet neglect that comes from doing things the way they have always been done, Amos Creel had stood on his store porch and said she was planning supper in December. He had smiled and counted the weeks until she would come to his counter with nothing left and no choice but his terms. But on a Tuesday in that same January, in a drafty shed on a dead man's claim 2 miles east of the siding, Marit Lund had opened a crate and pushed aside the sand and lifted out a carrot that was as firm and clean as the day she had buried it. Outside, the thaw water dripped from the roof, and the gray damp pressed against the walls, and the prairie waited to see who would last. She held the root in the lantern light, and the sand fell from it like dry snow, and it was the answer, quiet, specific, held in one woman's hand, to every voice that had told her she was wrong.